Good morning, everyone. First of all, Merry Christmas to all of you. Thank you very much for joining our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. First of all, our amazing speaker, Stephen Friedman, is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher and artist and then a scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. And we would like to give big thanks to Stephen for joining us today, and also big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining. We have a great topic today, so please enjoy. Make sure to give your comments, ask questions. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction, as always. I also want to thank the U.S. Consulate in Almaty, Dana, Elmira, the entire team, the staff that provides this platform for weekly philosophical address of a wide range of issues. We've seen, if you've been sort of following these talks, you see that I often take topics from United Nations International Days. I take topics sometimes from historical events that are commemorated, during a given week. Tonight's topic is broad, and not inspired by any particular, event or occasion, but inspired by what's sort of dominating our culture, which is social media. But before I begin in earnest, I wanted to just say a few things. Yes, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. This will be the last talk of this year, of 2021. Aaliyah is going on vacation for 2 weeks, and so we won't be having talks for the next 2 weeks. So the last week of December, the first week of January. But then we'll resume again, I think it will be January 14th. So 2 weeks will be off. Now, of course, when we resume again, I'm expecting that maybe that talk on January 14th will be like 4.5 hours to compensate, and I'll do 3 talks in one. No, that's a joke. That's not going to happen, though. If the platform were offered, it's something that I would be willing to entertain. Okay. I should say, I am not on social media, not to any significant degree. I have accounts. I'm sure they're still somewhere in cyberspace on Facebook, on Instagram, but I don't participate. And we'll see why. It's not that I'm averse to the technology. I'm certainly, I embrace internet technology. There's a question about like the digital world. Well, I embrace that fully, but I embrace it for specific purposes. These are tools, and I see them as serving specific interests. They either serve them well, and so I embrace them for those ends, or they serve them badly. And in that case, I don't embrace. I don't engage with social media for reasons of personal temperament, also personal interest. But again, I'm going to develop the stance that explains and also gives the philosophical sense of the value and the limitations, of those platforms. One place to begin is, I suppose, as much as anything, Facebook enshrines the social media culture and is responsible as much as any platform for its development, its proliferation. One of the main instruments of that success, that proliferation by Facebook's own account, is the film The Social Network. Really a very effective work of art, written by Aaron Sorkin, who is one of the greatest of all contemporary screenwriters, probably the screenwriter I most admire in contemporary cinema. Let me give you an image. Here is Aaron Sorkin, just so you can see who I am referring to. When I tell that story, as I have done repeatedly, about the 14-year-old boy who receives a gift of a horse, and the village applauds, but the Zen master is always cautioning, that we'll see what the outcome is, when the village is overcome with sadness over some consequence of that gift. Again, the Zen master is reserved in his judgment because we'll see. The future decides the past, decides value, decides the reality. That's going to be an important aspect, of tonight's talk. That story is presented in a script and in a film written by Aaron Sorkin, Charlie Wilson's War. That's where I actually first encountered that anecdote. So that's one of the reasons why Aaron Sorkin is a particular point of admiration for me. But his account of the rise of Facebook is illuminating and reveals aspects of really social media, its tendencies that are worth exploring in the context of that film. Now, I haven't made an independent study of the rise of social media. I'm going to use that film simply because it seems like they did an earnest job. And one of the reasons why I'm beginning there is the story starts at Harvard, and it starts at Kirkland House, which is where Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, lived when he was a student at Harvard. It's also where I lived when I was a student at Harvard. So there's that point of convergence. I was there years before Zuckerberg. And again, my fundamental interest is not in social enterprise. It's not in social spaces. It's not in convergent spaces. It's not in bringing people together in the sense that, for me, philosophy rigor occupies a divergent domain. It occupies a field of dignity that characterizes a divergent space where any two things are distinguished from each other, are distinctive, are non-comparable. A social domain is operating in the opposite direction. It's bringing things together for the purpose of social vitality, social abundance, social power, and so it is functioning heuristically. Remember, the main functionality, the governing functionality of heuristic space, where any two things are approximately the same for some purpose, is convergence, is a bringing together. When Mark Zuckerberg talks about placing everyone on Facebook, the entire human population on Facebook, he's entertaining a heuristic enterprise. That kind of enterprise can help. It can help us survive. It can help us achieve certain ends. It does not achieve the end of rigor. It does not achieve the end of salvation, in the sense that salvation, the religious impulse, the religious category, can be explained and achieved through the exercise of a limiting philosophical rigor. And a rigor applies to a divergent space, a space where each individual's distinctiveness, the fundamental dignity of each object is being recognized and enshrined. Well, when you read about the early days of Facebook, again, as portrayed in that film, you see tendencies that it seems like Zuckerberg was dealing with tendencies of, well, a sense of exclusion, a sense, there are these organizations at Harvard. They're called clubs, final clubs. Now, Harvard does not have fraternities and sororities, those kinds of undergraduate organizations that are popular at most American universities. One of the reasons why I chose Harvard was because it doesn't have such organizations, because I don't tend to join, and participate in group endeavor. I'm interested more in singular advance. Again, it's a matter of my personality. But there are these organizations at Harvard called final clubs that play a similar role. They're not quite as celebrated or as central a feature of campus life as fraternities and sororities are at other universities, but they have a presence. You have to be invited to join, okay? I think, again, as the film portrays, Zuckerberg wanted invitations and wasn't receiving them. And so he felt excluded. So, there's an element of social climbing and trying to achieve social validation that is operating, again, within the mythos of the film at the point of origin, of that platform. I received some invitations to those organizations, and I never responded. I mean, if they had encouraged me, if they had welcomed me, enthusiastically, I would have walked the opposite direction. Again, that's me. There were some people, both from Harvard, not from Harvard, that have known me for a long time, that when that movie came out, thought that there were certain resemblances between me and Zuckerberg. One of the distinct points of demarcation is that I've never been a social climber, and I've never felt a sense of exclusion. So I've never wanted to embrace a group or draw a group of people to me. One of the inspirations for Facebook was to achieve a network, a group connection that you had a key to, and you could choose who you would allow in, who you would exclude. Again, that's what I'm describing are characteristics that play out within heuristic space, where, again, we are grouping things, we are drawing things together. Now, one of the fundamental characteristics of that space that, again, lies at the foundation of the tendencies that support social media is a comparative process where we are making comparisons between us and others. It's obviously common, for human beings to do that, common for individuals to evaluate, to rank, to assess. Well, any kind of ranking, evaluation, measuring is a process of convergence, of bringing two things together and assessing the degree of fit, match, congruence. The act of measuring at any level is such an associative, convergent, heuristic process, not an epistemic process. It's not a process relating to a complete solution to the world here and now. It's a process relating to what fulfills certain particular ends. So when we are measuring the length of something, what we're doing is bringing together a measuring stick and the object and comparing. But we are achieving a convergence. It's a heuristic process. Measurement is heuristic. Science, as I've emphasized, is fundamentally heuristic. It's not operating at the limit of rigor. It can't reach that level because it's making comparisons. It's making comparisons that are always approximate. Those comparisons might be comparisons when it achieves measurements. It's making comparisons when it's doing a controlled experiment, and it's comparing an experimental group to a control group. The problem is that the two things it's comparing are never sufficiently the same that the comparison can rise to the level of rigor that philosophy recognizes, that philosophy entertains, and that achieves the ultimate power of philosophical results, which again is a power that really exceeds the powers of religious traditions, because religions are operating within realms of belief, faith, mythology. Philosophy is operating at a level of incontestability. And that incontestability is partly owing to the simplicity, the clarity of its formulations, right? Like, I'm going to come back to this issue later, especially when I address some of the questions from last time. But in general, when I'm making philosophical claims or representing philosophical results, the language is not technical, it's simple. I can explain everything, relate everything to circumstances that we cannot leave the world to view it. We cannot experience or see the world from the outside, that the world is different in different directions. Two things are not one. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. If tomorrow we wake up to a fundamentally different reality, this was dreamed. This was not the ultimate reality. So these are relatively straightforward ways of communicating, right? Simple. Well, one of the, let's go back to the issue of comparison. One of the things that began Mark Zuckerberg's career that led ultimately to Facebook was an app that he developed. Again, according to the film. Again, I'm using that as, and even if it's not quite the story, for our purposes, it illustrates certain points, issues, aspects, tendencies. In the same way that when I go back to the origins of Buddhism, I talk about that myth of the Buddha encountering disease, old age, and death. Well, that may not be exactly how it happened historically. We don't know. We can't go back and view those circumstances, but it's useful to address those issues in the context of that mythology. Okay, and then we can proceed beyond that, to rigorous formulations. Well, the same thing here. So one of the things, and it got Zuckerberg into trouble at Harvard with the administration, is he developed an app that would allow people to make comparisons between women at Radcliffe, at the, the female college at Harvard used to be called Radcliffe. Now Radcliffe has really been assimilated into Harvard itself, Harvard College. I think it still might exist as a separate administrative entity, but basically the women at Harvard, he sort of designed an app to make comparisons between, in terms of appearance, in terms of looks. Well, again, that kind of comparative process is a heuristic process. It is now, one of the fundamental features of a heuristic process, a comparative process, when we're bringing two things together, approximately for some purpose, is it's not rigorous. And the important point is that when we are operating in heuristic space of whatever kind, and a convergent space is a heuristic space. A social media space is a heuristic space. We're dealing fundamentally within an approximate space and a tragic space. Because the way out of tragedy is, going back to the origins of Western philosophical thought in the work of Socrates, a reasonable point to start. We suffer, not because of what we know, not because of what we do not know, not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. Whenever we're operating within realms of approximation, within realms of that type of a non-rigorous domain, well, that's where suffering enters. Now, one of the things I emphasized in the talk on the United Nations is that there are two ways to address the problems that arise within heuristic space, within a comparative space. One is to step out of that space into the epistemic, the divergent space where comparisons are not possible. It's the space that corresponds to that Cervantes, the great Spanish writer of Don Quixote, his comment that comparisons are odious. Well, be that as it may, they are not rigorously justifiable. And so philosophy, can exclude them, from its rigorous enterprise. But heuristic space has its value, its utility, right? That's what heuristic means, to have value, to have utility to some end. Well, one way to address the problems that arise in heuristic space is to leave that space. The other way is to achieve a greater or a different order or mode of convergence, to bring other elements together. So, for example, when we are in a social media space and we are being brought together, and we are being brought together in comparative structures, well, you can make other comparisons. The value of being within a heuristic space is there is no compulsion. Rigor compels us. We have no choice. 2 is not equal to 1, no matter what your protest may be to the contrary. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past, no matter what you might otherwise contend. But heuristically, since we're dealing with approximations, well, if a controlled experiment gives a certain result, we can always challenge that result because it's not rigorous. We are not nailed to the results that arise within the sciences. We are not nailed, compelled within any heuristic space or sphere. So if you are finding yourself making comparisons that are creating distress, despair, anguish, well, make other comparisons. And the comparison that I've mentioned before, that Eric Hoffer, the 1960s American, actually from San Francisco, a longshoreman philosopher who wrote mostly about the political climate and movements of the 1960s, focused a lot upon the implications of the countercultural movements of the time, but also wrote in an aphoristic form that I found engaging. It drew me before I'd even developed my own sort of aphoristic form of writing. He may have been one of the contributors to the development of that style. Oh, Eric Hoffer, and I've quoted this before, famously remarked, my reconciliation, my acceptance of my life, my circumstances, stems in no small measure from the fact that in my lifetime, men far more deserving and gifted than myself died like rats in trenches, in concentration camps, in Soviet labor camps. So we can make that kind of comparison. When I was an undergraduate at Harvard, I was making those kinds of comparisons to myself, independently of, this is before I read Eric Hoffer, but, I remember saying to a teaching assistant in this religion course, this comparative religion course at the Divinity School, that the fact that human beings had endured such fates as the concentration camps of World War II meant that no individual was above such fate. And that, in a way, sort of protected us. But again, the point of philosophy is to have answers, but the answers arise at the level, of rigor, at the level of a divergent, non-convergent space where we're not making comparisons at all. But if we want to make comparisons, we can make those kinds of comparisons, and that can sort of help fortify us, within, the circumstances of our life. Well, one of the things to keep in mind, always in the context of social media, is something that Emerson was a 19th century American philosopher. Again, I've cited him in the past. The philosophy building at Harvard is named for Emerson. It's Emerson Hall. I have a photograph of it. I haven't shown this before. Let me just show it here. Okay. That is Emerson Hall at Harvard. That's where I spent the majority of my time in classes in that building. It's named for Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's characterized as a transcendentalist philosopher. One of the things also that characterizes his work, as I was referencing philosophical writing, is its clarity, its simplicity of expression. If you can't express something simply, it's likely because you haven't distilled the results satisfactorily yourself. There's no reason for jargon or technical vocabulary, scholastic language in philosophy. The great philosophers from Descartes, Hume, Wittgenstein wrote simply and clearly without technical jargon. Well, one thing that Emerson wrote that I've gone back to repeatedly is, great nations, great spirits have not been boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life. Not boasters, not buffoons. Unfortunately, most of what one encounters on social media is in the nature of boasting. It's in the nature of buffoonery. It's in the nature of an enterprise to draw attention. And why does one draw attention? Because of a sense of fundamental weakness or inadequacy. So one needs to have one's self-esteem bolstered by the strength of the convergent space in which one finds oneself, one imagines oneself. Remember, heuristic spaces are imagined. They're not rigorous. They're not the incontrovertible reality. That's a divergent space. That's a non-comparative space. But when we are weak, we engage in a display, a show of power, right? I've emphasized in the past that any display of power is weakness. When according to Christian tradition, and I've stressed this before as well, when God enters the world, he doesn't enter as Alexander the Great. He doesn't enter as a world conqueror. He doesn't enter with legions of troops. He enters as a poor carpenter. God, at the extremity of power, does not need to make a display of it. There's a tradition in this country, maybe other parts of the world, of sending Christmas cards. It's a fine tradition, but part of that tradition is to show your family in its most favorable light. It's to boast. It's weakness. Every display of strength is an admission, fundamentally, of weakness. But you see it online, everywhere. When people are trying to get an abundance of likes, well, again, it's a convergent process, right? They want to draw attention to themselves. That's a fundamental heuristic process. It is fundamentally a tragic operation. It is a confession of weakness. I have a friend in Texas who's 30. So she's grown up mostly in social media culture. She's vulnerable to the kinds of psychological stresses that one encounters on social media, where one is assailed with people's representations of themselves. And there have been documentaries on the process of achieving social media prominence. There are companies that one can go to purchase likes. Those companies are used not just by non-celebrities, they're used by famous individuals. One of the things that the agents, the publicists of celebrities do is, apparently, according to some of these documentary exposés, purchase likes, large numbers of likes, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, to bolster one's image. But again, when we're talking about numbers, we're talking about convergences. We're talking about aspects of heuristic space. We're talking about fundamentally weakness. We're talking about the sources, the seeds, the ground of tragedy, not the solution to human life that one finds in divergent, epistemic, rigorous, philosophic space. Well, this friend of mine in Texas has a pastor, and she's gone to that pastor on a number of occasions to get his advice, to get his perspective on social media, on the engagement that she finds often depressing. Many people find depressing, right? Because again, you're being exposed to people's boasting in a comparative, a convergent setting. Well, the pastor emphasized it's all boastfulness. Every show, every display of what you are, what you have, how many likes you have. Well, there's a term for this. There's a description for this in the Bible, in the Old Testament. The Old Testament that is embraced by both the Jewish, the Christian, and the Islamic traditions. It's in the book Ecclesiastes, the teacher, the preacher, supposedly written by King Solomon. one of the wise figures, of ancient, biblical life. Well, the famous phrase that occurs as a refrain throughout Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Look at me. Look. I will boast, so you look at me, so I feel better about myself. I will play the buffoon to attract attention, so you look at me. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. We think that there are people so extraordinary, and that's what we aim for, that they cannot but draw attention. This is not true. I had a business manager once, over 20 years ago, who was he was the CEO of one of the world's leading marketing companies. He was a master marketer. He did the marketing for companies like McDonald's. He was one of the most prominent, most admired, most influential figures in that field. And he became my business manager. And he told me that no one becomes famous by accident. You become famous because you want the attention. You want to be the center of attention. You want that affirmation. I mean, I've stressed the example of Ian Wilmot. No one knows who Ian Wilmot is. Ian Wilmot's name could be the most celebrated in the world today, because Ian Wilmot, over 20 years ago, was responsible for the biological breakthrough of cloning. He first successfully cloned the sheep Dolly. That was considered the holy grail of biology before it was accomplished. That still ranks as one of the greatest achievements in the history of the biological sciences, in the history of science. We don't know his name. We don't know what he looks like, because he's not seeking that attention. So it's not an accident. When somebody has 1 billion followers or 100 million followers, or whatever it is, they want it, and fundamentally, at some level, they need it. It is a sign not of strength, but of weakness, I'm sorry to say. And that's what that pastor emphasized to my friend, that you will feel bad as you journey through, that social media space, because you are being assailed by people's, again, boastfulness and buffoonery. Now, when we hear social media, well, the important term there is social, right? And we think we can't denigrate, we can't diminish the value of the social. Aristotle stressed that human beings are social animals. It's part of our nature. It's the fundamental part of our nature, according to Aristotle's representation. Well, we think, when we address issues of human nature, of the Delphic Oracle. That's what first comes to my mind, right? The Delphic Oracle, by the way, was an oracle at the Temple of Delphi. I have an image. Oh, and let me show you here. I didn't show you this earlier. Here is Kirkland House. That's where Mark Zuckerberg conceived Facebook. And that's where he and I both lived as undergraduates at Harvard. But Aristotle The Temple of Delphi in Greece has a ruin today. The Delphic Oracle's famous admonition, know thyself. Right? So if we are social animals, social creatures, that's what we want to know. Right? We want to come to terms with what we fundamentally are. But here's where philosophy, in its rigor, helps free us. Remember, there's a religious admonition, the truth will set you free. The truth that sets us free is philosophic truth, rigorous truth. The truth that nothing can deny, that nothing is stronger than. None of our heuristics, none of our scientific representations that don't rise to that level. Well, what's the truth that sets us free, that philosophic truth, that rigorous truth? Well, I read an aphorism in response to that Delphic oracle proclamation or encouragement, know thyself. And it goes, know thyself. As if one could, independently of futurity. When we think of knowing ourselves, knowing that we are social animals, knowing whatever it is we think we know about ourselves, it's really as if we're knowing ourselves as a character in a novel that we are seeing from the third person perspective, from the outside. We can see into that nature, mainly as if we were creating that character. We're not seeing ourselves from the outside, but we imagine we do. It's a characteristic of heuristic space to do that, and that's because it's a characteristic of linguistic space, and I'll deal with that in a little more detail in a short while. But first, I've stressed that I, in general, do not hear accurate, incisive, clear representations of existentialism. My summary of it is ultimately, my distillation of it is ultimately that we cannot view the world from the outside. That all of existentialism reduces to that and its implications. And when I say that Einstein and Heisenberg were doing the physics of existentialism, it's because they were attempting to describe the world from within. That's not typically how scientists imagine what they're doing. They're imagining that they are painting a picture of reality as if they were seeing it independently of our experience of it, from an Archimedean point, an outside observer. That's really what objective space or objectivity amounts to, that sense of an external view, an external representation. It's an illusion. It's a device. It's a heuristic. It can help us. It can help us advance technologies. It's not the path to salvation because it's not a rigor. Well, the most famous summation of existentialism within that tradition is by Sartre, the 20th century French existentialist philosopher, who wrote, "Existence precedes essence." Now, that's not the clearest distillation of existentialism, but it's explainable through my account. That what that amounts to is that we think we have a nature, we think we know what we are, independent of experience or independent of future experience. We think we can predict, because again, it's as if we are seeing ourselves from a third person perspective, like a novelist creating a character. Sartre's formulation, existence precedes essence, is that our essence is only revealed over time through our experience. That we do not know. We cannot know, because knowledge doesn't rise to that level of an external perspective. It pretends to, but it doesn't ultimately achieve it. Thinking in those terms, thinking that we can know ourselves in that way, thinking that we are, let's say, fundamentally social animals, and so we have to engage socially. That's our nature. Thinking in those terms is not freeing, it's constraining, it's limiting, it's imprisoning. One of my summaries, aphoristic summaries of the central aspects of my philosophical work is heuristics converge to constrain, epistemics diverge to transcend. Well, our sense of our nature, of what we are, that we are social and we demand social interaction. We demand the kind of social engagement that social media affords. It's an illusion that we impose. The untoward, the problematic consequences of that arises in situations like, and I use this example a lot, Van Gogh, for example. I tried to find some early drawings of his to show you. But when I went online, there's so much Van Gogh that even when I look up early Van Gogh drawings, I get late works. Even when I look up Van Gogh student drawings, I get the drawings of students of Van Gogh's art. So I was not successful in finding finding images of some of his earliest drawings when he was 27, 28. Because when he began his artistic career, he could not draw. If Van Gogh were to have taken those drawings today to an art instructor, they would have encouraged him to follow some other direction in his life. They would have stressed that his ambition of being a painter was delusional. I've known exquisite draftsmen, people that worked for Disney, that were Disney animators. And they, when you talk to them about Van Gogh's art, they say that they can see the awkwardness, they can see his deficiencies as a draftsman, even in his most mature work. But early on, it was obvious. It's obvious to me, it's obvious to anybody that, is in that world, that, that has, a background in drawing, a background in painting, that Van Gogh started out without talent. Okay? What are we going to say at that point? That Van Gogh's nature was what? Not that of an artist. The point is that he worked diligently and through a convergent process of repetition, of pushing himself, of studying the work of others, of analyzing what he was doing. He was very bright. He was able to develop into the most popular, great painter in history in a period of 10 years from when he began. That would not have been anticipated. That would not have been felt to have been in his nature. So our sense of nature, our own nature, whatever that sense is a heuristic sense. It is not a epistemic, rigorous representation. It is a limitation we are imposing upon ourselves. There's that famous line from Shakespeare, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself king of infinite space. There's somebody who understands what the human mind is capable of, no matter what we think our nature is. If we don't imprison ourselves in a sense of expectation, well, it's not clear what isn't possible. Right? So I actually had a student once who would pursue avenues that he saw me pursuing. So at one point, when he was my student, I began writing poetry. It was the first time I had done that. Well, the next thing, he was writing poetry. I started doing art. He was doing art. I would write philosophy. He was writing philosophy. And it was, I have to be honest, it was irritating. You know, I thought, you know, he's copying me. You know, as people say, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I found it disturbing. Okay, I wanted him to find his own way. But maybe that was his way of finding his own way. And I remember mentioning something to his brother about that, and his brother said something that was more intelligent than my sense of the situation. His brother said, well, you don't know. Maybe he will be Michelangelo, the next Michelangelo. You don't know. We didn't know with Van Gogh. So again, our sense of our nature, even as social animals, is a premature assessment and limits us, doesn't free us, and doesn't allow us to fully leave behind the limitations of heuristic space and leave behind the sufferings and the comparisons, you know, that space entertains and that social media enforces and reinforces to our peril. That sense of the future deciding the past, even as to ourselves, even as to our nature, even as to our nature as social animals, is something that I have in a series of aphorisms that actually appears in one of my websites early on. And it goes, we do not know what is coming next. What comes next decides what we are and were, and where our best interests lie. Not knowing our best interests, we do not know what we should love, hate, desire, fear. This is salvation, the message of the second coming, the condition of Eden. Any questions? Again, the past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past, even as to our nature, even as to our sense of our nature, even as to our sense of our nature as social animals, even as to our sense of having specific social needs. These are all presumed, and they are presumed in advance of future experience and help shackle us, imprison us, not free us, as rigor does, as epistemic space does. I've talked about how social media is a comparative space. It's a space that brings people together, so it's a convergent space. It's a space in which people play out their insecurities, where there are boasters and buffoons drawing attention to themselves. Well, it's a space that we can leave behind at will. Not because it doesn't have interest for us. We can use it as we can use it for our entertainment. We can use it for inspiration if that's, That's something we can derive from it. But again, it's not something that we are condemned to. And we're not condemned to a nature as social animals that must occupy such a space. The sense of what we need, needing others, needing society, needing social engagement, that too is presumed. That too is a limitation that we impose upon ourselves within this heuristic realm. We're going to look at some of the sources of that very soon. But one of the aphorisms that is fundamental to my work and my sense of how my work, my philosophical work, is able to free one from these types of constraints and burdens and dissatisfactions is this aphorism, selflessness, how one acts not out of need. Notice begins with that term selflessness, where the emphasis is not on our sense of self, but the fact that we can't articulate that sense of self, know thyself, as if one could, independently of futurity. It's a presumption, is our sense of self. To our peril, we presume what we fundamentally are. That aphorism, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, I found effective in undercutting my particular fears or phobias, even physical pain in different circumstances, because needs are presumed. Every need, even the need for oxygen. I know this is going to sound extreme. Keep in mind that philosophic space, rigorous space, is as extreme as the imaginings of any religious tradition. It's as extreme as a vision of mystical union with God or the experience of that, but it is not metaphorical. It is not mystical. It's simply rigorous, that because everyone up till now has needed something or has been presumed to need something, because everyone up till now has died, that doesn't mean rigorously that you will or you do. Again, it's a radical space. It's radically divergent, this rigorous space, this philosophical space. It's radically liberating. It's liberating from all our concepts. And that's the most powerful of all liberations. Now, we hear talk of, in the context of our nature as social animals, nature of beings that want to engage socially, and that social media facilitates that type of engagement that addresses our fundamental needs. But we hear talk in science, the form in which that often takes in scientific representations is of hard wiring. It's what our brains are wired for. It's a metaphor. It's closer to poetry than it is to reality. The fact of the matter is, again, it's a view of ourselves as if we were seeing, observing, experiencing ourselves from the outside and can know of such a thing. It's not that we look into the mind, see hard wiring, see circuitry, and then conclude that our behavior is constrained in certain paths, in certain directions. It is, as so often is the case, the opposite of that. We feel that we are constrained. We see patterns in our behavior, and then we are able to ground that within our theoretical structures of the apparatus, the physiology, the neurophysiology of the brain. If our behavior takes a different direction, then our wiring changed. It's not that the wiring is something that guarantees an outcome. It is a metaphor. And it is a metaphor of a picture of the world, again, seen from the outside. Not a reality, but a representation of a heuristic reality that can serve certain ends. What are those ends? Well, in some cases, those ends are medical. That if we know that if we can identify certain pathways in the brain that are the seat of certain disease processes, then we can interrupt those disease processes by operating on those pathways. It's heuristic, but it's never fundamentally a conceptual constraint. It's not that we know we are hardwired for something. We know we are hardwired for social life. We know we are hardwired to need others, and we can't help ourselves. No, it's our behavior that decides what we are hardwired for. And if our behavior changes, then the wiring changes. This, again, is fundamental in our understanding of our circumstance. It relates to that statement by Maimonides, the medieval Jewish philosopher, whose work for me comes down to this one statement: reverse everything you believe. You'll be closer to the truth than you are right now. That is true for virtually every aspect of heuristic space. The only thing that is not true for is philosophic, rigorous space. There's no alternative. There's no option. But for everything else, there is. And often the reversal is more revealing than what we originally embrace. In the case of science, we talk about belief, believing in the science, believing in the scientific results. Science is as much a system of belief as religion is, because it's not grounded in rigorous representation, because a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible. So there are always alternative accounts. The reason that we embrace scientific results as having greater claim is they're highly convergent. And that's what strength in heuristic space amounts to. But a highly convergent result heuristically falls short of the power of a rigorous result epistemically. It's incontestable. We don't talk about believing in philosophy, believing in a rigorous result. We have no choice. And that's the power that frees us ultimately from, again, what we imagine ourselves to be, but only imagine, even as to our social tendencies and dimensions. A lot of this ultimately has its source in language itself, that our social spaces are spaces where we're communicating. A communicative space is facilitated by language. Language facilitates even more than that. It facilitates our fundamental ability to coordinate our behaviors and to achieve goals that individuals alone are not capable of. It has enormous survival value. Pascal, the French 17th century philosopher, wrote about our frailty as human beings, that we can't contend well in nature with predators like lions or tigers or bears. But our mental capacity makes us competitive. Our mental capacity, in the context of societal engagement, facilitates survival. It's language that allows us to coordinate behavior. Once we have language that allows for the development of social structures through coordinated behavior, then we have the means of thinking because we have the vehicle for thought. Without language, there would be no thought. It's not that we have thoughts to communicate, so we develop language as the vehicle. No, language develops as a social institution, a facilitator of social coordination. And then language facilitates the technologies that facilitate survival. And why do I say this is the ultimate grounding of heuristic space? Because linguistic structures, concepts of chair and table, whatever the concepts are convergences. Concepts bring together individual objects based upon similarities. Family resemblances is Wittgenstein's term. Approximate similarities. They cluster in the way that convergent space, heuristic space, is a clustering, in the way that social media space is a clustering, in the way that creativity is a clustering process. These are all things that can help us achieve certain goals. We can build fortresses. We can defend ourselves against natural threats. Better working communally, engaging cooperatively. But again, survival is in one direction, salvation, the solution right here, right now, independent of all possible future experience, that's epistemic, that's rigorous, that's achieved by recognizing the nature of the fundamental conditions of existence itself, that this is not a comparative domain, but a field of individual dignities that are non-comparative. Another way to say what I've been saying is that social media is an artifact of social space, social tendencies, where we seek convergences for heuristic ends, but seek salvations oppositely, in the opposite direction. Okay? So, now I wanted to, I know it sounds a little bit radical when I'm saying, we're not necessarily social. That's not our fundamental nature, because any stipulation of a fundamental nature runs counter to our fundamental existential circumstance. We cannot know, and we presume to our peril. We presume more than we know to the end of time and suffer. We suffer our presumptions, not the rigorous reality of our circumstances, of our dignities. We hear, and this arises within the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, God is love. That love is the answer. The Beatles write songs that all you need is love. Well, what is love? Love is an instrument of a convergence. It plays itself out in heuristic space, convergent space. Anytime you think in terms of things that are being drawn together for any purpose, and what's the purpose there? For the perpetuation of the species, let's say. But anything involved in a convergence, a drawing together, is heuristic. The solution ultimately, the reality ultimately, is divergent, the opposite direction. Now, there is, in the end, a connection between the two. God, if we want to say God is love, well, the logic of the concept of God is that of a universal convergence. All things converge on God. God is everything brought together. When all things become one thing, concepts disappear. Concepts do not arise within a divergent space, within a rigorous space, within a philosophic space, an epistemic space, because that's not a space of grouping. It's a space of individual distinctiveness, where any two things are rigorously distinct if they can be distinguished at all as two and not one. Anytime we are bringing things together, well, we're drawing a conceptual sort of bound around them. But when we draw everything together, well, then distinctions cease. And when all distinctions cease, concepts vanish too. When all things become one thing. It's like if the tones in this room all became exactly the same for every object, we wouldn't be able to distinguish objects, and the objects in this space would seem to disappear. So the way of expressing that philosophically is the limit of the heuristic, when all things become one thing, is a non-conceptual space, an aconceptual space that is identical to a rigorous epistemic space where concepts don't arise in the first place. So the limit of convergence, in fact, is equal to the limit of divergence. That's what this last proposition, the heuristic converges on the epistemic, means. It's probably the most profound of all the philosophical results that I've developed. But that's an illustration of it. It relates to the idea that within the mystical tradition, when people are talking about an actual experience of God or of mystical union with God, they write things like Meister Eckhart, the famous medieval German mystic, wrote, "I am a something among some things, and so I go." The concepts have vanished within that extremity of convergence that is equivalent rigorously to the extremity of divergence. But again, that process of bringing things together is a conceptual process. The process of distinguishing them, because two is not one, is the foundation of rigor. St. Augustine wrote, not God is love. He wrote, of God, we can say nothing. We can say nothing of God, for one thing, because at that level of universal convergence, there are no concepts that apply anymore. But he was not quite thinking in those terms, even though those terms do account and provide a logic for what he was saying. But God is transcendent, God is greater, than anything we can understand. But we often hear talk of the silence of God. Well, again, God is a conceptual at the limit of convergence, where all things become one thing, concepts no longer operate. In the same way as within a divergent space, concepts do not arise. So, social needs presumed, social spaces presumptive. Our sense of being social animals more than we can claim, and we claim it to our peril. Buddhism goes in a different direction. Buddhism is closer to sort of depicting a divergent space. Again, it doesn't do it rigorously, but it's something I'm sympathetic to. And again, Buddhism was operating, it was being developed 2,500 years ago. I have been the beneficiary of 2,500 additional years of philosophical development and understanding of the nature of rigor that was not available, at the time of the development of Buddhism. But there is in Buddhism a famous sutra from the early tradition that I've read from before, and I'm going to read right now. It's the Rhinoceros Sutra, and it gives that opposing view that we are not fundamentally social, and that our salvation is not in the direction of the social, not in the direction of the social embrace, not in the direction of a convergent space, but the opposite. Okay? And I'm going to read that, yes. I can tell that I'm running out of time. I'm almost at the end, and then I want to address questions from last time. I'll probably address them in a more concentrated manner, than I might otherwise want to, but I just have a few more things. And so let me just read a few paragraphs from the Rhinoceros Sutra, so you understand that the alternative to that Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, the embrace of love and of social spaces, is itself embraced by a major tradition of humanity. So the sutra goes like this. Let me see where it is. Do I have it here? Yes, I have it. Okay. Put by the rod for all that lives, nor harm thou anyone thereof. Long not for son, how then for friend? Fare lonely as rhinoceros. Love cometh from companionship. In wake of love upsurges ill. Not the solution, ill, the problem. Seeing that bane that comes of love, fare lonely as rhinoceros. That's the solution within the Buddhist tradition, the opposite direction. In Ruth, for all his bosom friends, a man heart chain neglects the goal. What's the goal? Salvation. A complete solution right here, right now, independent of all future experience and not needing anything outside our circumstance. Not relational. Definitive, as rigor is. Seeing this fear in fellowship, fare lonely as rhinoceros. Again, we presume our nature, we presume our social selves. They are heuristic structures. They are presumptive. There is the famous Hindu lullaby. Child, you are yourself. When you sleep and when you dream, and even when you are awake, look at the world going by. You don't have to be threatened by it. You don't have to be comparing yourself to it. You don't even have to be engaging with it. You can observe it, and you can observe it in a state of peace and contentment because it doesn't fundamentally infringe upon your fundamental dignity as an existing thing, not comparable to anything else, not vulnerable fundamentally to the comparisons that social media tends to embrace, tends to project. There is, two more things. One thing to keep in mind also, God is singular. One thing, at least within the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. So not, and when one's seeking mystical union with God, when seeking that as a solution, it's been said, I mentioned this not too long ago, that a contemporary of St. Catherine of Alexandria would describe philosophy as the pursuit of mystical union with God, where, again, you're in achieving that singularity, not the social embrace of it, achieving the singularity of a complete solution right here, right now, independent of all possible future experience. Now, I wanted to read two more things quickly, and then we'll get to the questions from last time. One is something that Emerson wrote at the end of a work of his, an essay called Illusions. I began with Emerson's comment about great nations, great spirits not being boasters or buffoons, that we find so much at the core of so much of social media. Well, Emerson writes this. Emerson famously wrote an essay, Self-Reliance. He focused upon the dignity of the individual, in the same way that Kierkegaard said that on his tombstone, only two words would be necessary: the individual. Okay? That's where our dignity is. That's ultimately where our salvation is. So, every god is there sitting in his sphere. The young mortal enters the hall of the firmament. There is he alone with them alone, they pouring on him benedictions and gifts and beckoning him up to their thrones. On the instant and incessantly fall snowstorms of illusions. He fancies himself in a vast crowd which sways this way and that, and whose movement and doings he must obey. In a vast crowd, like the crowd of social media. He fancies himself poor, orphaned, insignificant, because he's engaged in comparisons within this social space. The mad crowd drives him hither and thither, now furiously commanding this thing to be done, now that, to keep up with others. What is it that he should resist? What is he that he should resist their will and think or act for himself? Every moment, new changes, new showers of deceptions to baffle and distract him. Presumptions, the presumptions of a nature that we can't ultimately justify and that we embrace to our peril and ultimately to our delusion. And when by and by, for an instant, the air clears and the cloud lifts a little, there are the gods still sitting around him on their thrones, they alone with him alone. That's the nature of epistemic reality, of mystical union with God, of Christian salvation, of Buddhist enlightenment, and that rigor achieves. But again, incontestably, right here, right now, independent of all possible future experiences, that preserves and recognizes and enshrines our fundamental dignity in a non-comparative space. And finally, I have an aphoristic book, and then I will get to the questions. And the book goes like this. It's, again, highly concentrated, poetic. It summarizes what I've been saying. I'm just reading this so you hear the sound of it. Social spaces. Preface. Tragic spaces are heuristic domains. Tragedy as society is a tool. Epistemics obviate tragedy. We suffer the imprecisions of social spaces. Rough representation debases. Mortality is society. We see darkly in others less than ourselves. Sketchbooks of worlds poetically consider. There's a word missing here. Sketchbooks of worlds. Shoot, hold on. I have the actual copy here. I'm sorry that I did something that deleted. Okay, let me read the end of it. Sketchbooks of worlds poetically console. We understudy tragically every role, every social, societal role. Okay, again, philosophy is that truth that at the limit of rigor sets us free, even from the constraints of social spaces. Okay, now, last time I had some questions. We don't have a lot of time. I will go very quickly, unfortunately. Okay. The first question is about Baudrillard, who is a sort of postmodernist philosopher. I wanted to say something very quickly about Baudrillard. His writings are obscure. That is to the detriment of his reputation and his thought. They're obscure and they're contorted because he himself did not achieve a clear distillation. Within the great Western philosophical tradition, the most compelling philosophy, the greatest philosophy, has been expressed clearly. He did not. Postmodernists in general do not. That is a fundamental, really a fatal failing. Baudrillard talks about, there's a conference that one of my roommates attended. I don't know if it was in this country or it was in Europe, but a question was asked about these postmodernist philosophers, Baudrillard, Derrida, Lacan, and the moderator said, they're your problem now, talking to an American. We're done with them in Europe. Well, again, they didn't do their job, these philosophers. Their work is not distilled to clarity. Baudrillard talks about progressing socially from a society, a world of objects, to a world of signs. Both are heuristic artifacts. The solution always is in the direction of rigor, which is opposite to both. I'm asked a question here. Obviously, it's very brief. I can go into Baudrillard at great length some other time, but could you please share your ideas on the global trend of digitalization, painted to an extreme level of uncertainty of any progress? Digitalization is a tool. It operates in a technological, a heuristic space. We use it as we can to achieve certain ends. In general, it's meant to help facilitate solutions to problems that were not solvable, readily previously. It has advantages. It creates problems that then become the challenge of the next phase or the next generation to solve. So yes, technology has always created problems and always poses new challenges to address technologically or otherwise. The way out of any of these issues is always in the direction of rigor of circumstance. Always remember that whatever devices, technologies we're using, they are things that we use for our purposes. They can be accepted, adopted, or not as we choose. They are not rigorously grounded, and so they're not something that we are constrained to embrace. And finally, I know I'm going very fast, do you agree with Jürgen Habermas on the post-secular state conception? I do not. His view is that a post-secular state, which is sort of grounded in a scientism, will return to various modes of religious belief. No. What I'm offering here in terms of the nature of a rigorous space is what has the power to substitute rigorously for all the religious traditions. So what I see as happening in time to come is a recognition of the nature of the heuristic as being that which we voluntarily embrace for some purpose or other, but the final solution to our circumstances is in the rigor of our circumstances, and that supersedes and is independent of any mode of belief, religious or scientific. Okay, so I know I went fast at the end, but I wanted to get those questions in again. This is our last talk of the year. I want to wish you a very happy new year. I know this has been a challenging year. COVID continues. The pandemic continues to provide stresses in our lives, but Science is powerful. Molecular biology is powerful, as we're seeing. Vaccines are effective. They are everything that a virus has, except for all the bad things. All vaccines are elements that stimulate our immune system as the virus does, but the vaccines do not have the potential to cause the kind of disease that a virus causes. So vaccines are the holy grail of biology. And vaccines are what every physician in every branch of medicine wants for every condition. So this pandemic has shown the ability for science to develop even more powerful and effective and safe vaccines than ever before. So this will be a revolution in medicine in the years to come. And so, yes, so technologically, I see great power at play, and philosophically, I see definitive power at play. So I think we're actually well positioned, as the next year begins. Okay.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you. As always, every talk is interesting, engaging, and very informative. Thank you very much for dedicating your time for today's talk. One more time, let's give big thanks to Stephen Friedman, our amazing speaker. Happy upcoming, or already is, Christmas. Hope you enjoy your day. And one more time, on behalf of American Space Almada team, we would like to give big thanks and congratulate you with all the warmest wishes. Hope you can come and join us very soon, Stephen. And thank you, the audience, for being with us. Thank you, Katrina, Sophia, for your comments, for your feedback, and we will definitely address all of your questions next year. So
Yes.
yeah, we will get back together in January. So stay in touch. Thank you very much and have a great week. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again so much. And thank you, Olivia. Thank you.